Okay, why don't we get started? Again, good afternoon and welcome to the ISEP and ERE seminar. Today, we are very pleased to have Professor Destenie Nock from Carnegie Mellon University give us a presentation on a timely topic on energy poverty, measuring it and planning for it. It's a topic that is of great interest to me personally. I've spent a lot of time studying energy poverty, especially in the South Asian context. And today I'm very excited to introduce Professor Nock to the audience and hear what she has to say about this essential topic. We are going to hear first the professor's presentation, and then after the presentation, we are going to set aside time for any questions. As usual, feel free to use the Q&A box to ask your questions. I will monitor it, and then I will moderate the discussion after we are done with the presentation. Professor Nock, the floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. So today I am going to present to you all about how my group and I are thinking about energy poverty, measuring it, but also planning for poverty alleviation. This work is a collaboration between myself, Destenie Nock, my student Su Chen Kong, and our collaborator at the University of Maryland, Dr. Lucy Kuhn. So first, how do we measure energy poverty, and how are we thinking about measuring energy poverty? When we are really thinking about our goals around sustainable development and ensuring that we reach the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 7 to ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable modern energy for all, this is really where we're getting the basis of alleviating energy poverty. So without energy poverty, there probably wouldn't be a need for this goal. And when we think about electricity access and what it means to have access, we think about it in typically 5 facets. So the first is going to be affordability. So can you actually afford to pay for the electricity that's coming into your home or in your region? The supply is if it's there or not. And typically this is what people think of when they think about energy poverty in the developing world context. The quality of supply is when you plug up those appliances, are they going to overheat? Are they going to have as long of a lifetime as they're projected to? Quantity is how many appliances you can have in your house. Reliability, of course, that is what we've seen with Texas and the recent blackouts of can you depend on the reliability of electricity systems, especially when you need them. So not only in a developing world context where we think about reliability issues where people might get outages on a day or weekly basis, but in the United States, are we going to get outages during extreme weather events when people are entering deep freezes, or even in California during the heat waves? So when we're thinking about energy poverty in my research group, typically the first thing that comes to people's mind is, can you afford it? And that's when we're thinking about the developed world. So here we have a picture of the United States, and energy burden here is defined at the county level. So the darker the region in the US, the higher the percentage of income people report spending on their household energy bills. So the darkest is if a person spends 19% of their of their income on meeting their energy needs, and the lightest color is about 6%. So energy burden is what we think of as like this kind of core, so the smallest level of energy poverty. If you go out one level, that's energy insecurity. So that might be when you are worried about your reliability concerns, maybe you're worried about brownouts, or you have a higher percentage of blackouts in your region. And then energy poverty is this largest concept where that includes all of the facets of electricity access, particularly the supply side. Which is why a lot of times when we think about energy poverty, the first place people go is in the developing world context. So I know that this is a fully virtual experience, but I did want to have a chance to get to know what people in the audience care about. So we are going to have a link posted in the chat. If I could open up this chat, there it is. And so the link that you see here is a link to a Google Doc. And if you guys could go there and join me on this Google Docs slide, that would be great. So that's going to be this interactive portion here. And what we're going to do is I would like to get everybody's opinion on what your main energy equality concern is. So we should see people pop up. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, awesome. So just drag an X to wherever you view your main energy equality concern. So for pollution, a lot of times we think about the distribution of pollution in low-income areas. Access to jobs can also include if people are at risk of losing their jobs or access to new jobs that are being created. People's ability to make comfortable indoor living temperatures. We have reducing forest outages, unequal energy costs, and then access to electricity. And I do see that one person is on slide 3. So if you want to stay with us and stay with our interactive portion, you can join us back on slide 2 and just give us your opinions. We have 3 right now. And for some reason, I can't get the chat to come back up for me. So if somebody is commenting in the chat and one of the organizers would like to help me see that, that would be great. Okay, great. So of the 5 people that joined us here, I see that the biggest concerns are access to electricity and unequal energy costs. Now, unfortunately for us, we are actually looking at this one, the people's ability to make a comfortable indoor temperature in this talk, and I will explain that in a little bit more detail as we go back to the PowerPoint. So when we are thinking about how we currently measure energy poverty, typically I have seen metrics on 2 different axes. So the vertical one are primary and secondary metrics. So primary means that we are able to calculate that based on data straight from the residential customers. Secondary metrics are going to be indices calculated by bringing in other information at the aggregate, typically at the aggregate level. Then we have absolute and relative metrics. So absolute metrics are going to be those threshold metrics, which say if you're above this, you're not energy poor, and if you're below this, you are energy poor. And relative metrics, of course, are comparing you to other people that live in your region, in your town, in your city, or other things like that. So the most common metric that we have seen is the traditional energy poverty metric, which deals with the cost and how much percent of your income you spend on meeting your energy needs. Then we have the absolute and secondary metrics, which are functions of objective and subjective indicators, like at the household level or the county level. This can be thought of as the vulnerability index. We also have self-reported subjective energy poverty indicators. These typically come from surveys of these customers. And then we have energy access consumption matrices, which I saw a lot of you put on that interactive portion, thinking about, do people have access or not to electricity? But one of the things that this is missing, and one of the things lacking from the literature, is people's consumption and behavior. So we have information on how much they're spending on meeting their energy needs, but we don't know if they are actually adapting their behavior so they don't need to spend as much income. So take, for example, 2 households. The first is a couple that is very cold on their couch, and the other is a family that's very nice. They have t-shirts on, they're all happy on their technology. So household 1 has an income of $30,000. We assume household 2 has an income of $100,000. They're in the same region. Household 1 spends 5% of their disposable income on meeting their energy needs. So according to that traditional energy poverty metric, they are not defined as energy poor. And same goes for household 2. If they spend 5% of their disposable income on energy, then again with the TEP, they are not considered energy poor. So one of the big things that we are adding to the literature is that the traditional energy poverty metric based on income misses human behaviors and people's tendency to reduce their energy consumption because they know that they don't want to spend as much on meeting their energy needs and as much on their bills. So the motivation behind this project is to unveil the hidden energy poverty for a population using electricity consumption patterns We actually are using a data set from a utility company for 6,000 residential customers, and we're going to measure the progress of energy equity within a region. So if you're wondering where our energy equity gap fits on our lovely map, it's right here. It is a primary metric that's going to be a relative indicator of energy poverty. The study area in our work is going to be in Arizona in the US. So if you have no idea where it is, it's in this conveniently highlighted red box. And the climate here is going to be long, extremely hot summers, very mild winters. And it has a lot of coal generation, which you see as the black dots. It also has some nuclear and other fossil fuels and oil as well. And they do have some solar, which are yellow dots that are a little hard to see on this map, but there is some there. In our research process, we take household level utility data. So in this upper box, we match that with a demographic survey of the residents' income, minority status, household type, that type of stuff. We also gather local temperature data to understand how people's consumption behavior is tied with outdoor temperatures and temperature changes over time. They then calculate the household inflection temperature, which I'm going to actually explain in the next slide. And using that information, we calculate our energy equity gap for the year, and that's our main output. So the inflection temperature. The inflection temperature we are defining as the temperature at which a household shifts from using their heating to cooling systems. So this can be thought of as the temperature, the outdoor temperature at which a household would start to turn on their AC units. Now, this is one key factor to keep in mind here is that this is for Arizona. So if we were going to apply this metric to the Northeast, where people use a lot more heating, then we would need to separate out those spring and fall months. But here we can use the entire year because Arizona is known for their long, hot summers. So our hypothesis is going to be that lower income households will have higher inflection temperatures and endure hotter indoor temperatures to save money on cooling. So our inflection temperature is that star point here. So if I'm going to quickly explain this graph. At the x-axis, we have the daily mean temperature in Fahrenheit. On the y-axis, we have the daily electricity consumption in kilowatt hours. Each data point is representative of one day for this specific customer. And this is just a graph of one customer. So we have 6,000 of these in our study. And here, this household's inflection temperature is going to be reported as 69.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So our methodology involves performing a regression analysis to understand how these inflection temperatures vary by income group and minority group as well. And so some of the things that we are capturing in our regression analysis as factors include daily temperatures, the electricity price within the region, whether or not it's a weekend or a holiday, because we do know that people's behavior changes based on the day of the week fixed effects, as well as the month time of the year fixed effects. So here we are reporting the inflection temperatures that we've calculated for 1 year in our study by income group. On the x-axis, that's the income group, where 1 is the lowest income group. So that's people that are reported to make less than $15,000 a year. And income group number 8 is the highest income group, where we have people making $150,000 or more per year. The y-axis is going to be the inflection point. And so here, each box plot is representing the range of inflection points. Now, for our energy equity gap, it is defined as the difference in median inflection temperatures in the lowest and highest income groups, which you see in this equation at the top. So for the year 2015 to 2016, we find that there is a 5.8 degree difference in the median values between the lowest and the highest income groups. And one of the things that we've been kind of wondering is how has this changed over time, shown in this convenient graph that just popped up. So the inflection temperature we see in 2015 to 2016 was reported as 5.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Oh, sorry, let me explain this. So the y-axis is the x-axis is the different years, the y-axis is the inflection point, and each line represents a different income group, which is here in this legend. So we find that the energy equity gap has decreased from 2015 to 2016, and then after 2016, something started happening again where we actually now have higher energy equity gap in 2018 to 2019. So we wanted to dive a little bit deeper and understand how has this changed within different demographics. And so here is a sense of how our group, how the income groups are distributed within our population. And so we have here on the left-hand side, the income group is again the same. So 1 is the lowest, 8 is the highest. Our ethnicities are, the green bars are going to be our white or Caucasian residents. And then yellow is our Asian population, red is the Hispanic population, and then black is going to be the Black population. So we have found that, of course, we have a higher percentage of Caucasian populations here, but we do have a decent proportion of minority income groups. So we wanted to understand how the energy equity gap is changing within those different ethnicity groups. Okay. So for the median inflection temperature for each ethnicity, we have that on the left-hand side. And you can see that we start to see decreases in all of the different groups, so different ethnicity groups. And then most of them start to follow this upward trend, except for our Asian population. So then within a group, we can ask, okay, well, let's say that we were deploying a policy specifically targeted to, for example, the African American or Black population, which is that dotted black line. Then has that actually helped the group universally, or has it specifically been used by maybe the more wealthier members of that minority group? So that's where we're using this energy equity gap by ethnicity. And we can see that dotted black line does start to decrease. So that means that in general, everybody is becoming closer together. So that could be interpreted as that policy is equally benefiting people within that ethnicity group, regardless of income. But then we see this sharp uptick, meaning that there is greater inequity between members within the same racial demographic or ethnic demographic. We also see the same thing within our Asian populations. So that would be something that's very important for policymakers to understand, is like who needs to be targeted with their different policies and who is actually being able to uptake these policies and incentives. So ongoing work, and this is something that I welcome feedback on, is what's causing this energy equity gap to shrink and then widen again. So first, we looked at cooling degree days. So they actually have the opposite trend where we start to see decreasing amounts of cooling degree days. And so maybe this is going to be linked to a higher deployment of policies. That's one thing that we are considering. And then we also see that the electricity prices have been rising over time from 2015 to 2018, and then they started to fall again. So one of our hypotheses is that behavior changes may take a while to catch up to price shifts, which is why we start to see that widening right after this very high price increase. So of course, we would like to compare our metric to the traditional energy poverty metric. And just to understand how the findings of the level of energy poverty within a region might change based on the metric that you're using. So on this slide, what we have are the traditional energy poverty metrics for different years. And on the x-axis, that's a log scale. That 10% metric, the 10% measure is if you fall below 10%, so below that dotted line, then you would be defined as not energy poor. And then of course we have the number of households on the y-axis. So at the top, we report the percent of population that is defined as energy poor. And we see that if we just use the income 10% metric, we would think that we're actually doing relatively the same regardless of the year. So this is one reason why we think that relative metrics might be a little bit more beneficial for policymakers within their region. because right now we don't actually see too many people crossing that threshold. And I should say that our respondents do not change across years. So these are the same residents across all of the years. And then we looked at the average traditional energy poverty metric by income group as well. And we see that within the income groups, the only one that comes close to going over the 10% metric is, of course, the lowest income group. But even if we were using the energy burden metric of if you spend 6% or more of your income on meeting your energy needs, then you're defined as energy poor. Then we wouldn't find anybody within any of these groups to be defined as energy poor or having a high energy burden, and we would only target our policies on the lowest income groups. So some of the policy implications from using our analysis is that when considering households for energy subsidies, using the 10% traditional energy poverty metric leaves out some energy poor households because that they may limit energy use to save money. The energy equity gap captures relative energy equity across a population using the same information required to calculate the TEP. So one of the benefits here is that no further data collection is required to calculate these two metrics. So they can be used as complements as opposed to supplements. And the energy equity gap shows the effect of energy planning and investments rather than just specifically the number of poor energy households. So it can give you a sense about how energy poverty is changing across a region. Some future work involves investigating whether the COVID-19 pandemic has affected people's energy use, so applying that energy equity gap to 2019 to 2020 data. And we are also conducting a survey to analyze energy habits before and during COVID, hopefully after soon. And we're also conducting a choice experiment to elicit people's willingness to pay for the comfort of cooling. One of the other things that we would like to do in the future is to look for more data on energy policy linkages between the energy equity gap changes. We also have a need for more utility customer data from other regions, so that also leads to a nice option for collaboration should anybody be interested. So that is going to bring us to the second part of the talk, which is planning for energy poverty reduction. So before moving on to that, I did get one question asking, could the energy equity gap be considered as the average temperature and it doesn't depend on family income? So we did not look at family income when we were in our equation for calculating the energy equity gap. I mean, the energy equity gap does depend on income because it is the difference between the average inflection temperature in the lowest and the highest groups. So you definitely have to have income in there. And the energy equity gap considers the average temperature. I mean, we calculate it from the inflection temperature, which is an average for that day. So hopefully I answered that question correctly, and please ask it again if I did not. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears to think about planning. This work has been published in Applied Energy. And my co-authors and I think about decision analysis used to inform sustainable transitions. So when I'm thinking about a sustainable transition, one of the things that comes to mind are these three pillars. We have equality, making sure that people can have equal access to the benefits of sustainable transitions. We also have the development and transition itself. So that's when we think about the deployment of technologies, reducing our energy costs. And last but not least is environmental sustainability. So there are, of course, going to be trade-offs between all three of these different peaks of the triangle. So that brings us to our next interactive portion, the importance of transitions. So for those 5 people that were interacting with me, if you join us back in the discussion, in the Google Slides on slide 3, we will have another interactive portion where I would like you to tell me which objective you think is important, more important, and how much more important. So, for example, if I thought that these reducing air pollution emissions and creating jobs in a region was equally important, I would put it here. I'll ask that you don't choose equally important because sometimes they all just cluster there. So you And then if this one only matters, you put the X all the way over here, and same for the other slide. And the Google Doc link, the Google Slides link is in the chat if you do need it. Okay, so one of the things that I am noticing is that when we are thinking about reducing air pollution emissions and creating jobs, most people are saying that air pollution emission reduction is going to be a little bit more important than creating jobs. So that means that we're more focused on that environmental sustainability side than what I would consider more of like the social justice side. So if we go to slide 4, maybe this one's going to be a little bit tougher, but now you need to choose between reducing air pollution emissions and actually creating more access to the supply of electricity and reaching the universal access goal. All right, there's 2 people stuck on slide 3. So if you want to join us on slide 4, that would be great. And if you want to vote, that's kind of the nice thing about trying to make it interactive, if people can actually participate. But if you don't want to participate, we also don't force people to do anything. So it does seem like we're still really focused on reducing air pollution emissions, which is pretty typical because we have seen the more focus on environmental sustainability whenever we have talked about sustainable energy transitions. But these 2 things are not going to be mutually exclusive because, you know, if we are using coal plants, for example, to increase our access, then this is going to be linked. But if we're using wind turbines to increase our access, then we could also be reducing air pollution emissions. So that's just not to say that one is always going to be more important than the other, but sometimes one does take precedence in our public decision making. So when I'm thinking about equality concerns, I tend to think about it at 3 different levels. The first is the micro scale, and that's going to be those local environmental impacts. That's where we see a lot of pollution and water concerns come in. We also have the exclusion of rural areas from benefits, and then of course the ability to cool or heat your home. Then we have the macro scale, which is going to be at the global level. So that's the global extraction of materials and waste streams. Oftentimes we think about this for our phones and where our phone materials are coming from or going to, but often we can also think about this as, you know, wind turbine blades, where are all those going? They're kind of hard to recycle after we're done with them. So where are we getting these materials for these energy technologies, and where is the waste going to? Then we have the mesoscale, which is the national scale issues such as unequal access to renewable technologies. Again, that's air pollution effects is in there, job distribution, and increasing electricity prices. So for this part of the energy planning talk, energy poverty alleviation planning the talk, I'm going to be focusing on developing countries and thinking about how we can make sure that we are integrating equality concerns into our electricity models. So the last interactive part, I know you guys are so excited. I can hear all the silent cheers, yay, is going to be, where is Kenya in the US located on this Human Development Index map? So the y-axis is going to be the Human Development Index, which is a composite statistic of the life expectancy, education, and per capita income within a country. The x-axis is the per capita electricity consumption in kilowatt hours per person per year. And then each dot represents a different country. So what I'm asking you to do is think about where the US might lie on this graph and where Kenya might lie on this graph. And so that is the slide 5 here. So black is going to be for the US and Kenya is going to be blue. So to the 2 people who are participating in the audience, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. I don't know who you are, but just know that I appreciate you. Oh, we have 3 people now. Okay, so we have people guessing for the US. We have 3 very different guesses for the United States, and we have 2 widely different guesses for Kenya. Oh, we have a 4th person who's about to make a guess. Dun, dun, dun. Where are they going to put it? Okay. So in case you are wondering, the US is actually this nice dot right here. And then Kenya, this person in the blue that moved there, is actually like right about there. So let's go back. So one of the things that we take away from the Human Development Index is that while it has not been shown that there is a causation between energy consumption and human development, these are strongly correlated, and that can be seen by the fact that we don't see any low-income countries that have a low per capita electricity consumption with a high human development. So that's why we have this like logarithmic correlation. And so we do see that there are decreasing returns to scale for the benefits of just increasing your electricity consumption. And one of the reasons for that decreasing returns to scale is that, you know, energy efficiency measures mean that you can do more with less. Also, these kind of higher energy consumption dots are going to be those oil producing countries because it does take a lot to extract those materials. So bringing it back to those 5 facets of electricity access that we talked about, I just wanted to point out that this part of the talk is going to be focused on the supply side of energy access. So in the developed world, the situation is typically that the grid is well developed, access is unlimited, meaning the system is reliable, meaning that you might get a certain amount of hours of outage per year. Now, I just want to caveat that that was made before, this slide was made before the Texas event happened, so this does not take into account extreme weather events. So typically we have our optimization problem to minimize the cost subject to demand, reliability, and environmental constraints. In the developing world, this situation is often flipped on its head, meaning that the grid is undeveloped and access is considered to be limited, and the system can be unreliable, meaning that there might be hours of outage per day. The demand is unknown, often because many people haven't had electricity access in their home, or we don't know how much they're going to be willing to spend on their energy consumption. So now the way that I think the problem should be framed is that we should maximize social benefits subject to our costs. So these costs might come in the form of foreign aid, but government allocations, or other types of things. So now I will present to you my maximize energy access model, or the ME model, which wants to maximize the utility derived from putting potential electricity access within a region. So it's going to be this U, which is the utility, subject to X, the electricity consumption delivered to node I, and P is going to be the number of consumers in the different nodes. And here we have it broken down a little bit more. So this is going to be a function of the population. So the population PI is going to be multiplied by XI divided by PI. So that's the per capita electricity consumption. We raise that to a 1 minus alpha parameter, where alpha is actually going to capture a person's preference for equality within electricity access around their region. And then the -1, the 1 minus alpha, that makes this an isoelastic utility function, which we've actually taken from the economics literature. So the closer a person, the closer the alpha parameter gets to 0, that's going to represent a person that does not care at all about distributional equality. So they don't care at all about spreading those benefits around. They just want to make sure that whatever amount of electrons they can put in the system, they're going to maximize that. Whereas as alpha approaches 1, that means that now the person really cares about spreading out those benefits and making sure people have equal access to the amount of electricity they can consume. To give you a high-level overview of the flow of information within this optimization problem, the inputs include a social planner's preference for equity, so that's that alpha parameter. We also have constraints on the budget, geography of the country, as well as data and cost, data on population and cost information. Within the dotted box, that is the ME model. So within the new model, the endogenous variables that are decided within the model highlighted by these bold boxes are the generation and transmission investments. So how many power plants we build and where, and how many power lines we build and where. That feeds into generation and transmission costs, which run up to our power flow constraints. So we can't just put electricity anywhere we want to. And then that's going to feed into this electricity consumption calculation. So actually now, based on the power plants that you have, where are you leaving electricity around the region? That feeds into some cost calculations, which run up to our budget constraint. And then the electricity consumption also feeds into our social welfare function, which is going to be the utility of electricity excess, or our objective function. These are key constraints in our model. We have budget constraints, which are a function of transmission costs, generation costs, and they have to be less than or equal to our budget. The electricity availability or power flow constraint says that the electricity at node I, or Xi, has to be less than or equal to the generation at node I plus the flow of electricity into node I minus the flow of electricity out of node I. And then our generation constraints say that the generation of node I, so we actually have multiple different types of power plants in this model. We have hydro, solar, oil, as well as PV diesel mini grids. So all of that generation at node I has to be less than or equal to the sum of your capacity at node I. And there are many other equations in this model, too many to bore you with and to spend on in this talk, but there is a paper. So if you ever want to talk more about that, I would be happy to talk about it. And this has been implemented in Gurobi and Python. In our initial case study, we are focusing on Liberia, which has a population of about 4.6 million people, and the electrification rate at the time of starting this analysis was 10%. So the population you can see in this map on the left-hand side, and Montserrado is the county which holds the capital city of Monrovia. On the right-hand side, we have a pie chart where we're detailing where Liberians get their electricity from. So most of the people that actually have electricity access are connected to the Liberian Electricity Corporation. So that's going to be their main centralized power system. That's about 5%. And then we have community generators, personal generators, as well as vehicle batteries. And then 81% of people were reported to have no access at all to electricity at the time that we started this project. So these are two maps detailing outputs from the Maximize Electricity Access for All model. On the left-hand side, we have a $5 million a year annual budget. On the right-hand side, we have a $10 million a year annual budget. This is going to be for the high equality preference case, or alpha equals 0.86, which we sourced from the correlation between the Human Development Index and the per capita electricity consumption by country. And another key assumption is that these annual budgets are invested every year annually for 30 years. So another thing is that the blue diamonds represent hydropower plants, the yellow diamonds represent PV diesel mini grids. If it's a black dot, that means there's no generation infrastructure there. And the green lines represent low voltage transmission line infrastructure. So in both of these maps, we see that the optimal electrification plan under a high quality preference case is to use the existing hydropower plant and connect as many people as possible to a low voltage transmission network, and then fill in with solar, PV diesel mini grids, and solar home systems. And then we also see that in the $10 million annual investment case, we have used a ton of decentralized power generation to bring people up close to tier 1 level access. And we find that, of course, so the Gini coefficient is our measure of distributional equality that's solved after the optimization is run. And so the closer you get to 1, the more inequitable your system is. So the ideal point is to have a Gini equal to 0, which means that everybody can consume electricity at the same amount of electricity no matter where they are in the country. So then if we increase the $10 million annual budget by a factor of 5, we find that the optimal electrification strategy becomes to use large centralized power plants in the highest population dense areas, and then expand the low voltage transmission line infrastructure. And that's does have some implications, because if the goal of developing countries is to maximize their energy consumption availability, no matter where you are in the country, then as we are deploying these decentralized solar home systems and PV diesel mini grids, we need to make sure that they are large grid compatible, so AC compatible. So that way, when we do reach this large centralized infrastructure system, we do not have all these systems being abandoned and a waste of resources as well as investment dollars. So then you might also ask, well, how do different people's preferences impact the way that they would make investments in the electricity system? So on the left-hand side, we have a person that doesn't care about equality, so that would be an alpha of 0.10. And on the right-hand side, we have a person who has a very high equality preference, where alpha equals 0.86. And in the low equality preference case, we actually see kind of what we see now with large centralized power plants being built at the capital cities. And so that's going to be the existing hydro plant and the existing oil plant. But in the high quality preference case, we actually tend to lead ourselves to even the more sustainable technologies, where we've primarily focused on using our hydro facilities and our PV diesel mini grids, and then expanding our low voltage transmission line infrastructure. And we see that even if we increase the budget by a factor of 5, the low equality preference case does not actually reach their universal access target. And they've just deployed as much large centralized power plant capacity as they can, whereas the high quality preference case does start to deploy transmission line infrastructure much sooner. So a case for equality is actually a case for investment in transmission line infrastructure early on in the development process, which could help utilities in developing countries actually maximize their consumer base and not have to redesign their system when they start to focus on those rural customers. So some of the sustainability trade-offs that I would like to just touch on quickly as a part of this talk are the trade-offs that we're seeing between country per capita electricity consumption, the equality measure that we were using, so it's the Gini coefficient. We have CO2 intensity of systems as well as water intensity of systems. So for the the sustainability value on the y-axis is going to be a normalized value, and the numbers on the graph are to give you a sense of the magnitude ranges of these different values. And then the solid lines are going to be the high equality preference case, whereas the dotted lines are going to be the low equality preference case. So if we just take a look at the blue lines, for example, we see that there is going to be a trade-off between per capita electricity consumption and the equality index, right, for the low and high equality preference cases, as we expected. And then we see this big shift in CO2 intensity and on-site water intensity. And so one of the reasons for this is that the PV diesel mini grids that are used to spread out that decentralized infrastructure do rely on diesel, because that is much cheaper in the model than the battery technology for the cost that we found. When we included lithium ion batteries in this analysis at their current cost, we did not see any deployment of PV battery mini grids at all. And so that's one of the reasons why we shifted to diesel. So in the future, if we did see a sharp decrease in those lithium ion batteries, particularly as electric vehicles become more deployed and more incentivized, then we do expect that the CO2 intensity of the decentralized generation would decrease, and that could also lead to less of a drop in sustainability from the CO2 intensity side. So some overall conclusions from this work include that we have created a new energy poverty metric, which I showed you in the first part of that talk from the planning side, which measures the energy equality of a region. And we saw that minority and low income groups do have different behaviors. So even though the groups, many people in the region were not defined as energy poor using the traditional energy poverty metric just based on income, looking at our relative metric, we do find that there are some more people we need to target, and this could also lead to a better understanding of the impact of different policies. Now, the work in the second half of the talk, so the energy poverty alleviation planning talk, illustrates how investment decisions change under different objectives and people's different beliefs about energy equity and the value that they place on distributional equality. So future work involves looking at the spatial distribution within regions, so looking at the distribution within a city area. There is a high need for trade-off models. There are so many different objectives in power system planning, and there's many different entities illustrated here. So in general, if you leave with nothing else, then just understand that we need tools that will provide insights for how stakeholders increase the level of energy access and energy equality to meet their sustainable development goals. Energy poverty alleviation is not just about reducing the supply costs of electricity or even the cost that people spend on meeting their energy bills, but it's about understanding who has electricity access, what are the benefits that we're spreading out across different regions, and how do our policymakers' preferences impact different energy planning goals. So thank you very much for listening and taking the time to join me on this talk.
Excellent. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. Lots to cover there, and we do have a number of questions. So I'm going to first raise the audience questions in the interest of time, and if you have a few minutes, I have a question myself. But let me start by just noting we have a question from Xiaoshu Ho, who's one of my PhD students. And so she's asking about the slope of the consumption temperature curve. So what if instead of just looking at the inflection point, you would also look at how sensitive households are to temperature changes? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we did not look at the slopes of the consumption temperature curve. So let's see, I see that, it disappeared. So I see that you assume that poverty is not only about the temperature when people turn on their heater / AC, but also about how much they would spend on energy at a certain temperature. Right, so we have information on the incomes and we have information on like their utility bill costs. So that's how we can actually calculate the amount of their income that they're spending on meeting their energy bills. But here we do, so like for the temperatures, there is going to be a window where you're not using as much energy and like you're not just using as much energy for your AC usage. And so when that curve really starts to peak up, like when we see that shift, that's when it's going to be really important, just because if it's really flat, then that's not really going to tell us like, okay, when are people turning on their AC units? When are they switching over? Because we do expect that once you start to turn on your AC unit, you're going to continue to use it over time.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you. And next, we have a question from Mariana Jimenez, who's asking about the interactive chart with the countries. So which country has the highest per capita electricity consumption? Do you remember?
Yeah, so actually, I think that's Qatar. And again, that's going to be like the really high oil producing countries. Yeah.
Correct. And that's one of the counter arguments against the energy development link, right? Is that those countries are using them very inefficiently. And right. So I think one of the points you made during the talk, which is that I think the best evidence for the energy development link is the fact that there are no poor countries that have very high consumption and there are no wealthy countries that have a very low consumption. Right. There's exceptions at the wealthy end, right? There's some that are very inefficient, some that are somewhat efficient, but there's nobody who's using like Eritrean level electricity.
Exactly. And also, I mean, so this kind of thought about how do people's beliefs impact the way that they're going to develop power systems. So obviously we have the sustainable development goal because people believe that there is some sort of link between electricity access and sustainable development. But yes, you are right. At the extremes, we don't really, we can't really say much.
Got it. And one thing I'll just add here is that I think it's important to make the distinction between that link kind of existing and then what the policy implication would be, right? Because right. One of the, as you know this very well, but just for the audience's perspective, there's been a lot of debate on, for example, even if having more electricity has some development benefits, there could be another intervention like, I don't know, vaccination or micronutrients that has even more benefits. And then the question becomes sort of, how do you deal with all this? And it's a very complicated topic, right? It's not just that you pick the one that has the highest dollar cost benefit ratio. There's so many things that kind of go into this calculation.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's I think the same person, Mariana Jimenez, is asking, do you have a paper about the Arizona? Is there a draft we can look at, or is that still ongoing?
Yeah, so the Arizona work is ongoing. We actually started this work because of COVID. So we started asking ourselves, okay, has energy poverty gotten worse within a region? And then I don't know if you guys can hear, but I have a space heater going right now, and I'm very cold in my house. And that's when we started thinking, hey, like, I bet there's a lot of people who actually are very cold in their houses during the stay-at-home measure, because you might not have things like insulation. For example, my house is 100 years old, and I found out that there's no insulation in my outside walls at all. And so we have these like different things where we're like, oh, well, we don't actually have a metric to calculate, like, when do people start turning on their AC units? How much are you using your heating system? And like, when do you turn on your heating system even? So that's why we started this work, really because of the pandemic. And so now we have started one paper that we have submitted to, I think, Science Advances with our collaborator, Dr. Lucy Q at the University of Maryland. And hopefully that one comes out. And that one's actually just showing how energy consumption patterns have changed across different groups, so across minority groups and more Caucasian groups. And we actually do see that minority groups have higher energy consumption changes than their majority group counterparts. And then this work is still in preparation.
Got it. So since we do have a few minutes, my question was also going back to the Arizona work. So just so that I understand, so the idea of the inflection point, is it mostly about, is your hypothesis that it's about the kind of homes people live in, or what do you think is the driving force behind, for example, poor people having a different inflection point from, well, is it affordability, is it the home type, or?
Yeah, so I think that it's going to be a combination of factors. So I think that like the home type, the age, like has it been weatherized or not? And then also like your income will play a factor in that, right? So if, for example, I know that my house is going to be very expensive in the summer, and let's say I'm doing my taxes and I see how much I made and how much I spent, then the next summer or the next year, I'm going to come up and say, okay, guys, like we need to not use our heating as much. You guys need to put on more blankets. Like we're going to just like not turn on these systems as much. And so then I'm going to adjust my behavior. And over time, I keep playing this game, trying to adjust to make sure I'm not going over, not overspending. You know, we also worry that during the pandemic, people losing their jobs is going to have a sharp impact on this. And that's one reason why we really want to analyze that COVID data there. But really the housing type, the age, and whether or not it's been weatherized, we think are going to have some big impacts on the inflection temperature.
Got it. And kind of a follow-up to that, it would be interesting. I don't know if it's possible to do in this current context, but kind of, can you identify households that don't, for example, use air conditioning, even when it's kind of objectively dangerous not to do so? Because you could imagine making a distinction between kind of just a preference. You could say that, okay, I'm not turning on my air conditioning because I want to save money, but it's fine. It's just a question of kind of slight discomfort, as opposed to suppose that it's really hot, so that it's actually possibly like could have some health effects, for example. And even then you don't put on your air conditioning. As we've seen, for example, in the summer heat waves, a lot of people who died this summer in some of the northern places where they didn't have air conditioning because they couldn't put it on.
Right. So that's one of the reasons why, like, a big caveat of this is that it is in Arizona. So because of the very long, hot summers, we expect that everybody has an AC unit or some sort of AC cooling infrastructure in their home. But one of the reasons why we actually settled on the inflection temperature is because, like, let's say that I'm using my AC unit, but just not that much. Like, we still will find an inflection temperature for that person. especially if we're only looking at like the spring and summer months. So, you know, it's not about the magnitude or your slope, it's just about when you change. So, you know, like we expect, so here on this graph, right, like we can assume that this is winter. And then all of a sudden we just see this sharp decrease, and there's like this huge amount of points where we're like, okay, we're not exactly sure like what's going on. They're debating on whether or not they're going to even use their AC. They're probably not using their AC at some of these really low points here. And then all of a sudden we can expect this sharp increase to be from AC units. And that assumption is just from our understanding that typically in households, the heating and air conditioning takes up 50% of the energy consumption needs. So that's another big part of this assumption here.
Got it. Got it. Interesting. Interesting. Let me just see before we conclude if there are still some questions. Mostly people are saying they're very nice talk and very interesting. I agree with that. So with that, again, thank you for taking the time to give the presentation, very insightful. And again, I'm particularly happy to see some of this work done in the United States, because I think, you know, for example, when I teach energy access, I mostly teach experience in the emerging countries. So it's really interesting to see how the issues are different and in many ways also similar in the United States. A little depressing sometimes, I have to say, to see the United States as some of these same issues. I'm from Finland, so we don't need to worry about the heat so much. The cold is a big issue, but I don't think we have too many households that actually need to worry about that. So the US has some ways to go dealing with extreme temperatures.
Yeah, and that is one reason why in our future work we would like to do this analysis for another region, because Arizona is like, you know, the South is very high heat climates. Right. And so even just doing this work in like Massachusetts, for example, we would need to think about like how to incorporate natural gas usage, electric heating. And we're hoping that this can also inform some of our understanding about how electrification policies are going to impact different groups.
Right, and that is a very timely topic again, with all the debate on Texas and kind of what would be the implications of electrification for reliability in these different disasters and extreme events. Yeah. Thank you for presenting. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks to the audience for following. So we all look forward to seeing your next paper in print, and let's be in touch. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you for the invitation. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.